God's law in the Dispensation of Grace, and the subtitle, Can't We Just Follow the Ten Commandments? What's not in your presentation is a little multimedia piece we're going to do here, just to introduce this. And I would take you first to 1 Timothy, starting in verse 3 of 1 Timothy 1. He says to his counterpart Timothy, his understudy, he says, I besought you to abide still in Ephesus when I went into Macedonia, that you mightest charge some that they teach no other doctrine. This is the Apostle Paul talking. Neither give heed to fables, endless genealogies, which ministers questions, rather than godly edifying, which is in the faith. So do this. Now the end of the commandment, he says, is charity out of a pure heart and of a good conscience, and of faith unfeigned. This is the King James Version. We'll talk about the King James Version in this presentation. He says in verse 6, from which some have swerved, turned aside into vain jangling. Okay, need a modern word for that. Desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor whereof they affirm. Jeremiah, hit play.
0507. Otis Q. Sellers, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. At the close of the last study, I was dealing with the statement in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, where Paul makes the declaration about those who desire to be teachers of the law. I said that to be a teacher of the law is in every way a commendable desire. We should be teachers of the law. The law should be taught. The law must be taught. Now, this does not mean that we should get people to try to observe the commands or the requirements that are laid down in the so-called, or the scripturally called, Ten Commandments. Neither to teach the law does it mean that we should get people to memorize the Ten Commandments, or that we should proclaim some parts of them as being the law. We become true teachers of the law when we set forth accurately and fully all that the Word says concerning it.
Pause it there.
Many who have memorized the Ten Commandments.
All right, that sets the stage. So in this presentation, we're going to discuss the law, and we're going to ask a number of questions, including this one here. Can't we just follow the Ten Commandments? Can't we just memorize them? Well, you heard Otis, you heard his thoughts on the matter. Well, let's dig into this a little. In other words, aren't these God's top 10 guidelines? If we follow them, won't we gain His favor? Can we obtain salvation through doing so? It's kind of an underlying thought, right? Is there something we can do? Can we be saved by some work? Will memorizing be of use in that endeavor? We've all had maybe Sunday school examples. I had a men's study group example of this, where one of our group said, let's study the Ten Commandments. And my ears perked up and I said, why? Why? What's your motivation for doing so? It's always good to ask that question, because where you come from sometimes alters where you end up. So we're going to put this question to the test, and a number of other questions, misconceptions, other things that arise. All right, to start, Andy Brown brought this up yesterday. You must have a pattern of sound words. Well, to do so, you must start with your terms and definitions. If we don't use the same terms and definitions, or we mean something different by those, guess what? We're not going to communicate. So let's see if we can get a few terms on the board here. Liberty, we're all Americans. That word means something to us, right? The synonym is freedom, independence, autonomy. Means being able to do what you want to do within a society without being oppressed. That's Webster's definition. Whoops. Law, system of rules. Particular country or community recognized as regulating the actions. You can read a chart as well as I can, right? What's the key line there? It's at the bottom, right? May be enforced by the imposition of penalties. Bob, don't raise your hand. Another show of hands. If you follow the law and you don't drive over 65 miles an hour on the freeway in California, do you get a reward for that? No. You only get, a traffic ticket if you go 75 or something, right? You only get a penalty. You don't get a reward. Commandment. Well, that's the Webster's definition. Directive or an order. Covenant. This came up, I think it was in your talk, Nathan. Covenant is an agreement. So, by the way, I want to thank the speakers from yesterday. You guys are great setup people. Really. You are. And I want to thank all of you for being here. And I mean this from my heart. So I was saying to a small group out in the lobby the other night, I said, this is like graduate school. I don't know that I'm trying to commend you. It's not that. It has to do with the fact that you're here means you have an interest in working to the graduate level. I mean it, right? Because as you'll see in this material, if all you do is memorize the 10 Commandments, as we're taught sometimes in Sunday schools, right? They become these objects of it's like aspirin with the word aspirin inscribed on them, which become an artifact as opposed to something that you can take into your heart, into your mind, and use them, as Otis said, to be a teacher of the law. What does that mean? We'll get into it. Stand by. First, let's go back to square one. Do a quick history of the 10 Commandments. So as I was thinking about this, I have made it a point not to put humorous anecdotes and things of that nature in this presentation, but I do have a humorous anecdote. So, what took place between Jehovah and Israel at Mount Sinai? The pronunciation for that, it's a proper noun. If I were to take Nathan's name, Nathan, and call him Nathan, he would look at me quizzically. Proper pronunciation, Sinai. How do I know this? We have a cat we inherited from our neighbors 2 doors down. They were Arabic, and his name is Sinai. Okay? That's how you pronounce the mount, not Sinai. With proper nouns, it's important to get the pronunciation right. As I said, people look at you quizzically. It's recorded in the book of Exodus. And here are the steps, about 7 or 8 steps. Show of hands again. How many pieces of media, how many representations of the 10 Commandments are described in the Scriptures? I count 3. Originally, it was written down on scrolls. And there was a set of original tablets which Moses destroyed. Then there was a second set of tablets. I count 3. I'm interested in discussing anybody else's math on that matter. God proposed a covenant. That's what he proposed at Sinai. It was an agreement. It wasn't a law, it was an agreement. He said, I'm going to make you a peculiar treasure. And Israel agreed to that. In Exodus, we go to Exodus. Now I have to log into my iPod because this is my traveling Bible. But we read that in Exodus 19, 5 and 6. You can see how fast Mark can type. And how fast the Wi-Fi is. But you shall be unto me, once again King James, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. This is Jehovah speaking to Moses. Moses came and called the elders of the people, laid before their faces all the words which the Lord commanded him, which Elohim commanded him. So it was all communicated verbally, and then it was recorded on scrolls. If you look at Exodus 24:7, you'll see that they had the book. It's called the Book of the Covenant. So they actually wrote it down. Now, Israel lived in that condition, and you could characterize it as a blessed condition, right? according to Otis Seller's calculation, approximately 47 days, give or take a day or two. All right, that's a month and a half. That period's covered in 20 through 32. We don't have time to read through all that, but it's there for you folks that are interested in the graduate school. You have a homework lesson. Question, could Israel have kept that agreement for 47 months, 47 years? They could keep it for 47 days, right? What prevented them from keeping it longer? Well, one thing to note is that there is in the Bible, in Exodus and Genesis, pre-Ten Commandments morality, right? Numerous Israelites demonstrated the necessary morality. We see this in Exodus 18:21. That's the portion of scripture we could go there, but the simple story there is Moses' father-in-law says to him, "You're burning yourself out. You're being the judge of Israel. You're sitting on this chair night and day trying to adjudicate all their issues. So why don't you pick number of people, 600? I don't remember the exact number, but make them judges in Israel and have that adjudication flow out of you because you're burning yourself out." He said, pick people that have these characters, these qualities, right? The qualities, have to do with people that hate covetousness, right? People that love Jehovah. So the morality existed. It existed in Israel prior to the Ten Commandments ever being given, right? In other words, those 600 people didn't need the Ten Commandments, in a sense, right? They already embodied that behavior. We're now at step 4. So Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and he's up there in the cloud, right? The mountain is covered in cloud. What do the Israelites do? They said to Aaron, "Come on, he's not coming back. We need a God to worship." They made a graven image, a calf, out of gold earrings, and started to worship that. They broke the agreement, right? It was the first term in the agreement. They relinquished their status. What did Moses do in response to this? He comes down from the mountain and goes, "Oh no." He says, this agreement no longer being kept. Breaks the tablets. So the Ten Commandments, as we know them now, were inscribed by the finger of God on a second set of tablets. At this point, Israel came under the curse of the law, right? So there's like 3 basic stages here, right? I mean, they have an agreement with Jehovah. They are in a blessed state. They stay in that state for a short period of time. And, one way to put that, right? One way of saying that is they came under the law. Prior to that time, they were over the law. That's just a figure of speech. Okay? But now, the law, the Ten Commandments, is doing what we normally refer to as the law, right? There are now penalties being exacted. Go back and read the original giving of the Ten Commandments. There are no penalties prescribed. The penalties come in now, okay, after they've broken it. Just a note, Book of Deuteronomy appears to be a bit of a repetition if you read through it, but it's really not. What's changed is now there's a new context, right? It's describing a covenant with an imposition of an absolute law, right? And penalties, etc. Key question to consider. We asked this before, just this is repetition from myself. Were the original Ten Commandments a law? Technically, no. They were an agreement. And the Israelite kept those agreement for 47 days and then failed. They were on top of the law as opposed to being under the law. In that short period of time, they were a peculiar treasure. They were the nation of priests. They broke those first terms of the agreement. Rhetorical question. It requires a little speculation, I suppose, but what blessings did Israel miss by breaking that agreement? You can only imagine what the book of Exodus would read like if that hadn't happened. Well, speculation again. If you read that section, I would just point to the Moses request for atonement. That sounds like one of these religious words, atonement. What does that actually mean? It means a covering over, a veil, something you place over so that you no longer see what was underneath it. God wanted to destroy the nation of Israel. That's what we read in Exodus 30-29. He wanted to destroy Israel. I'm going to kill you. I'm just going to kill them and wipe them out. Moses said, don't do that. He says, they were, you made a promise to Abraham. God still intends to fulfill that promise. But it's been delayed. All right, back to our original question. And we're going to apply it here, right, to the Dispensation of Grace, which is the purpose of this conference. Common questions. Are we under the law today? Didn't Jesus do away with the law? What about the new covenant? Isn't that the new law? How do we establish the law today? Otis alluded to that in that short recording we played. Let's start by examining some misconceptions. Misconception number one, Christ brought an end to the law. Well, I agree that his death made some changes in the law, but he did not bring an end to it. It's a half-truth. Let's go to Romans 10:4. It's a half-truth based on, I think, this verse, common misconception of Christianity. Let's see how fast I can type again. Is that faster than turning pages? Perhaps. In Romans 10:4, we believe this is Paul writing. He says, "For Christ is the end of the law, for righteousness to everyone that believeth." That word, end, means a goal. Means a goal. Christ was the goal of the law. We know that the law was given to Israel for righteousness. We know it was not given to the nations. Right? Israel, as we mentioned before, was under the law at the time that the words in Romans 10:4 were spoken. That was in the Acts period. Under the law meaning there's no justification by deeds under the law. Deeds of the law, right? Just the knowledge of sin. That's what you've got, right? When you have a set of detailed laws spelled out and the punishments if you don't meet those laws. Christ alluded to changes during his earthly ministry, right? Consider the responses to scribes and the Pharisees, the challenges that they presented to them. The woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. The punchline, as I think many of you know who are familiar with this passage, is in verse 11, right? What did he say to the woman? All the scribes and Pharisees, having been convicted, melted away. And she's standing there before him. He says, where are your accusers? She says, they've left, Lord. And he says, okay, well, I don't condemn you either. Don't sin anymore. Go your way. What should he have done under the law, right? Under the law, she was guilty of death. And of course, it brings the interesting question, where was her perpetrator? Takes two to tango. So he should have been there too, but that's neither here nor there. Jesus is alluding to a change in the law by the action he took there. Response to the scribe who tested him in Mark 12:28. Let's go to that one. That's an interesting one. Rather technical. It's almost like a lawyer talking. I believe in the other repetition of this in the Gospels, which I think is in Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. It's described as a lawyer. Okay, a lawyer comes and makes this query of Jesus. And clearly he's been motivated by his relationship with the scribes and the Pharisees who are looking for a way to trick Jesus, to tempt him, to trick him into saying something worthy, of being persecuted, put to death, etc. And let's see. So here we are in Mark chapter 12. And one of the scribes comes to him in verse 28. He says, which is the first commandment of all? Okay, in the Greek that means primary. What is the primary commandment of all? The foremost. Jesus answers in verse 29. The primary of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel. Jehovah our Elohim is our Lord, right? You shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind, all thy strength. This is the primary commandment. The second is namely like this. He didn't say there were 10. He jumps right to, here's the second. Love thy neighbor as yourself. So none other commandment is greater than these. The scribe was a little bit perplexed. He probably didn't expect that, that response. He says, well, Master, you've said the truth. There is, in fact, one God. There is no other. To love him with all your heart, to understand with soul, all strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that's more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices could ever be. Jesus said, you've answered discreetly. He says, you are not far. You are not far from obtaining the kingdom of God. You're closing in on it, is what he said. It's an interesting little exchange. Misconception number 2. The Jews rejected Christ, right? The Jews put him to death. Well, that's a misconception. Why do we know it's a misconception? If you read the Gospels in detail, you will see that there are 2 parties responsible for the execution of Jesus. He was seized by the leaders of the Jews, members of the Sanhedrin, and chief priests. Their accusation was he was making himself equal with God by claiming to be the Son of God. Therefore, that claim he's making himself out to be God. He should be put to death for that. They were enabled by the Roman legal authorities, the army of occupation, so to speak, and the governor who was trying to appease that community. The fact of the matter is the Jews were zealous for the law during the Acts period. We see this in Acts 21:20. That requires a little bit of translation work as well. Let's go to 21:20. I apologize for hopping around. I recommend you all get one of these. I use blue letter just because all the thesaurus and stuff, thesaurus is built in here, the interlinears are built in here. You can go back and forth very quickly. We see in verse 21 of Acts, when they heard this, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous for the law. The word there for thousands means myriads of myriads. It's tens of thousands, right? So the population of Jerusalem at this time was approximately 25,000 people from Roman records. If there were 10,000 Jews that believed, that's 40% of the population. If there were myriads of myriads, perhaps it was even greater than that. Doesn't sound to me like the Jews are rejecting Christ. Overwhelming majority, perhaps, have accepted him as Mashiach, Messiah. That's the Hebrew term for Christ, the Anointed One. Did Paul ever tell Jewish believers in the Acts period to forsake Moses and the law, and forego the parts of the law, such as circumcision, etc.? Well, no, Paul never said that, right? Paul was an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin. He kept the law. He cited that, right? He said, what advantage does the Jew have in Romans? We're still in the Acts period. Well, much in every way. The Jews, at this point, still had the oracles of God, the things which speak. Those things continued to speak. But after Acts 28:28, those oracles became available freely to the nations. So, time is important. I know our God is timeless, but we are humans and we live in temporal lines that are basically pretty linear, right? Paul declared, right, a change to the law in Romans in 29:31. He's alluding, I think, to what Christ, was alluding to when he spoke to the Pharisees. Justified the circumcised ones by faith. I think that's a typo, is it? Oh, no, that's actually correct. Now we justify the circumcised ones by faith and the uncircumcised by faith. I use that term only because circumcision is it's a verb, so got to supply a noun that makes a little more sense. But he's basically putting on the same footing, right? He's talking, his audience is Jewish, right? But there are many Jews. As was described yesterday, there were 2.5 million outside the land. That's the majority of them, right? And many of them are probably the uncircumcised ones. You'll notice that in Romans, wherever you see the word Greek, you need to substitute the word Hellenist. What does that mean? That's the way the original reads. Hellenist means an expatriate that is living in the Roman Empire to customs and practices, maybe even speaking Greek, but it has to do with the culture, right, that was predominant in the Roman Empire. That's what the term Hellenist means. You could be a Hellenist and live in Tunisia or something, right? You could live in Spain, but neither here nor there. If you were Jewish and you lived outside the land, that was a term that they applied to you if you lived in the Roman Empire. Do we make void the law through faith? That's kind of the punchline. Through faith, God forbid we establish the law, Paul says in Romans 3:31. Let's debunk another one. Misconception number 3. Jesus gave new commandments. Well, that's a misapplication of John 14:15. He said there, our Lord said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Well, some interpret that as referring to the 10 Commandments. Alternatively, some look at that as any instruction he gave to his disciples. Maybe that's something we should follow. Well, I guess I answer a question with a question. Why not apply this to the other commandments of Christ? He said in Luke 3:11, if you've got 2 coats, give away one. Give it to somebody else who needs it. In Matthew 6:42, give to him that asks of you. If someone needs money, give them a $20 bill. Give them $100. Give them what they ask for. Luke 12:32, sell what you've got. Give alms. I have 2 cars. No, I have 3. I guess you have 3 cars. I don't have any plans of selling. I got to get to work. I have to get to the grocery store. I don't have any plans on selling those and giving them away. But that's because I live in the dispensation of grace. This has not been applied to me. It doesn't apply to me. This was spoken, right, to his disciples. That was their charge. The question is, why ignore those commandments? Why be cafeteria-style Christians and pick and choose the things you want to follow and ignore the other things that have been recorded? It goes back to what Andy brought up yesterday. Principles of right division. And I've added one thing to your list. What does the passage say? That's why you have to kind of dig into these things and get to the root of the words and understand what the author was trying to say. Who was the passage spoken to? When was it written? What time frame, what administration was active? What is the context? I've seen it many times in sermons. People will pull a verse out of the Bible and make an entire sermon out of it for an hour. You go, wait, go back to the contents and read what's before, read what's after, and you go, that's not what this is talking about. Don't make that mistake. Misconception number 4, keep the Sabbath. I think you brought this up too. You guys are a great set of people, right? Well, what about keeping the Sabbath? What about it? Shall we go to church on Sunday? Well, once again, I ask a question with a question. I know it's a bit repetition, but in graduate school you do this. You learn to ask why. I have 2 master's degrees. You ask the question why, and then you ask it again, and you ask it again. You have to tunnel down, right? Why did we have a solar eclipse? Well, it just happens that the moon is the right size and at the exact right orbit that it covers, right? It creates a shadow, which is the exact size of the Earth. I don't think that's just some, personally, this is myself talking, I don't think that's an accident. You look at the other planets in the solar system, their moons don't have that behavior. I think it was a design. What was the purpose of the Sabbath day? God gave the Sabbath to the Israelites as a sign. Well, what is a sign? It's a symbol or emblem that represents an idea. What idea is in view here? Once again, the idea that Israel was a peculiar nation in the eyes of God. No other nation was given a peculiar habit, national custom and tradition. We're all Americans, right? No Canadians or anybody in this room, right? So We have a holiday called 4th of July. It's very peculiar to America. I think our forefathers would be very pleased to see we've turned it into a big fireworks show. It used to be a little one. It's a national custom, peculiar to this country. We only do it once a year. These were doing it every 7 days. This is not some simplistic idea of going to church on Sunday. Work ceased in Palestine on the Sabbath. You couldn't go to the gas station and get gas, so to speak. You couldn't go to a restaurant to be served. There was no one to sell to you, and you couldn't buy, and etc. You were expected to rest. Let's do a fast forward, take 2. We'll just talk a little bit about the Old Testament. We'll talk about the New Testament and break that into a couple little periods here. Many of you are familiar with this verse. Let's go there to Jeremiah. This is the so-called New Covenant. The New Covenant that Jehovah will make with Israel. I shall log into my iPhone, which is protecting me from unauthorized usage, I'm sure. Jeremiah 30:31. Actually, if you go down to 31:33. But this shall be the covenant that I shall make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law. This is a new covenant. It's a very different new covenant. It's no longer on 2 tablets of stone. Nope, I'm going to inscribe it on your inward parts. Write it in their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. It's a very different way to embody it, right? That's a promise that was made 1,000 years ago. Hasn't reached its fruition yet, but it will one day. If we then move to the New Testament and the earthly ministry of Jesus, the death of Christ, the shedding of his blood, it's an inauguration for this new covenant, right? Israel was redeemed from the curse of the law at that event. But the full outflow, right? You saw the blade stage of it. Saw the blade stage in the Acts period, but the full outflow has not taken place yet. That will not take place until the nation of Israel is reconstituted. What I mean by reconstituted, Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel. That's an image. All Israelites who passed away being raised up from the ground. The new covenant was operative in the Acts period. Let's go to Peter. 1 Peter 2:9. Apostle Peter speaking to Hebrews, that is Israelites. In Peter 2:39. I'm sorry, chapter 2, verse 9. Apologize for that mistake. He says to his Hebrew counterparts, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. Well, that only makes sense, right? If the new covenant is operative. That you show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of the darkness into a marvelous light. Rusty, from our conversation last night, there it is. So many people in this world today are in darkness. I have friends that, study the Quran. I have friends that are Mormon, study the Book of Mormon. They're in the darkness. I look forward to the day when the flashlight will be shined on them, just like it was shined on Paul on the road to Damascus. I think see a lot of people that will respond to that flashlight. One note by way of, I like to throw these in. Here's your piece of 1 Peter was written to Parapedemos diaspora of Pontus, Galatia, and Cappadocia. Yeah, okay, that's the regions of Asia Minor, right? Yeah, Asia Minor is what's now modern-day Turkey, coast of the Aegean. It was called Asia back then. A couple of notes there for you. Parapedemos is an adjective. If you read this, in the language there, the term that's used in the King James is strangers. That's a kind of a poor translation. It should be an adjective, expatriate or expatriated. That's what that means. And then diaspora means the dispersed ones. This is 2.5 million people who were alive at the time who were Israelites who were outside the land of Palestine. Now let's fast forward again. Dispensation of Grace. So what's the truth for today? Mankind, I like to use that term, men, women, and children. You can obtain righteousness by faith, related, and that's to do with your relationship to Jesus Christ. It's a very personal thing. It is for me. I'm sure it is for most of you. Being justified freely through His grace. It's an act of His grace. It's a gift. It's not something you can earn. I don't know of any works that you can accomplish to gain it. It is a gift. We have redemption that is in Jesus Christ. That's in Romans 3:2. For believers today, we are blessed, but we're not blessed by anything that comes to us through any covenant that was made with Israel. Neither the terms of the old covenant or the terms of the new. We're blessed because the death of Christ, has provided that redemption, that forgiveness to us. When God's outflow and His eon was turned to the nations in Acts 28:28, we are now in the flow of that river. We now have access to that water, that living water. Okay. If there are any difficult questions, I will take a page out of Bob's book and direct them to people like Nathan, because he's awake, or Milt, he's asleep, but perhaps we can awake him. Any questions? Steve?
You asked a question at the beginning of your talk about could Israel have kept the Ten Commandments longer than 47 days? I would say the answer is yes. They could have. They didn't, because we have an example in the New Testament of a couple that was perfect concerning the law. And it was certainly a longer period than 47 days. So
Yeah,
Zacharias and his wife, right? They did it for their lifetime,
Yes.
right? So it kind of begs the question, why?
it wasn't impossible to keep. It's just it didn't.
Let's put it into context. These people have come out of Egypt. Okay, we all know a little bit about Egypt, right? We've all read National Geographic or seen programs of Tutankhamun or something, right? The Egyptians had all these gods that looked like weird hybrids of humans and animals and stuff, right? Anubis with the funny, what is it, a dog head and whatever. That's where they came from. They had been in prison, slaves in Egypt for 400 years? It's a long period of time. So they, right? But they knew that Jehovah was their God, and they had no business messing around with a golden calf or anything else that would be an object, right? And you can fast forward to the present, right? If your God is a Lamborghini, God forbid, but right, with some people I think that actually happens, that transference happens, that becomes the focus of their life. How fast can we go? Let's get a Lamborghini. That becomes your God at some point. It's kind of sad, right? Because those things are vanity. Vanity, all is vanity. It's the words of King Solomon. What he meant was, those things will pass away. They will rust. They will fail. But Jehovah will never fail. He's not of this dimension in a sense, right? He isn't going to rust. The golden calf, well, all the golden things in the temple, right? The beautiful golden things in the temple. And what happened? Nebuchadnezzar carried them away. We saw, and they showed up in the movie, right? They showed up in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So we now have them someplace in the United States, right? In a warehouse. I apologize. That was the second joke. Any other questions?
Can you or anyone shed light on why sellers felt 47-ish days was the time period kept? Because that never made sense to me, because Israel wasn't even given the covenant yet. He was coming down from the mountain with it in his hand, and he saw the corruption and destroyed it.
No, but he had talked to the people. Remember, the people heard the voice of God.
Yeah.
And God spoke to them.
From the mount while he was
No, before Moses went up.
Before Moses went up.
But were they given the terms of the covenant?
Yes, in
They
writing.
were. Okay.
In writing.
I have that backwards, okay.
We'll find the reference here, right?
They had heard the Lord spoke it to them.
Good.
Yeah, and he had them on the tablets, and they hadn't seen those yet, but the Lord had
Okay.
spoken them to them.
So really Moses getting the tablets, going up, he was up there for 40 days.
Yep.
That's why I thought that was the part of the 47 days thing, with 40 days, well, but that
The
was...
40 days are part of it, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, but they've
It
been
was-
given it beforehand though.
They've been given it.
So, he was just going up to-
They've been given it one Sabbath before, I think is the way that O is reckoned it, right? So 7 plus 40 is 47. That's kind of simple math, right? That's simple math. And I got a laugh out of Jane, which is good.
You can't get your doctrine from Cecil B. DeMille's movies, what you're telling me?
I don't know, Charles, you know, the
No, honestly,
lead actor was a
Angie
good
and I watch
Moses.
that movie every year, and sometimes we get a little muddled up with our doctrine because they don't get things quite right.
I guess it depends whether you prefer Charles Heston or...
I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
Moses went up to the mountain just to confirm the covenant by having it written in stone, basically. They had already received it before.
They already had it in writing on a scroll.
They had it on a scroll
Yeah.
before he went up. Okay.
So he
That's the
got,
part I was just-
you know, if you follow that thread through, right, the second set of stone tablets they put in a box, right, the Ark of the Covenant, which they subsequently took to the Promised Land with them.
Right.
So that was meant to be a symbol, right?
Okay.
There, I can do math. I have a master's degree in science. It's like, you know. Sam.
You asked the question, what did Israel lose when breaking the covenant?
Okay, I didn't quite catch all the question. Could you try that again?
You had asked, made the statement,
Yeah.
what did Israel lose by breaking the covenant?
Yes, what did Israel miss? What might have they missed by breaking the covenant at day 47? I can only speculate, right? What did they miss? They wandered around the wilderness for 40 years. I mean, God might have put them on eagle's wings and taken them right to the Promised Land and kicked the Philistines and all those people out of the land into the Mediterranean Sea in a night if he decided he wanted to do that.
Drive them out with harness, wasn't it?
Yeah, you know, exactly. They wouldn't have had to fight their way through the countryside or any of that stuff. Right? I mean, maybe that's what would have happened. He would have said, okay, you guys have proved yourselves worthy, and we go. I'm speculating, but I mean, that sounds like when you look at what he did, right, in response, which was, okay, so all you folks who were part of this apostasy, whatever you want to call it, right, you're going to stay here in the desert. Your offspring will go into the Promised Land. You will not, with one exception, right? Joshua was like the only exception, right? Caleb. I guess so too. Good catch. Good question.
I always look at the new covenant as being the restoration of the broken old, and so maybe you could look at the new covenant as what would have happened. It wouldn't have had to have been a new covenant, but in terms of the new covenant are kind of fixing the failings of the old, that they would once again become a light for the Gentiles. There'd be no reason to save your neighbor
Right.
for the Lord.
Right.
The law is written in their hearts. That was the intent from the beginning. And God will have his way. He's never going to let sin and Satan have the victory. So
Imagine if the government that was set up in Israel, and I'll take Solomon's reign as an example, right? They were a preeminent kingdom, right? King David spent most of his time in warfare of various types, whether it was against Saul or against occupants of Canaan, right? But his son was the king of peace. I mean, effectively, right? We're not fighting anymore. All our enemies are subjected to us. They're subdued. Builds God's temple. He's known for his wisdom. People, right? The Queen of Sheba comes to him. So now, if that, right, to answer Sam's question, if that had continued, right? If they had had those blessings, if they hadn't broken that covenant, it might have been a very different, I don't mean to create, alternative histories. I probably actually can't do that well enough. Is your God big enough? That's another question, right, Bob? Is your God big enough? When you think about what he could have done, Sam, what could Jehovah have done? I can only imagine, right? It would probably exceed my imagination in ways that I won't even go there because I would just be completely babbling here. Yes?
Am I understanding that Cecil B. DeMille's movie is not inspired?
Cecil B. DeMille's movie was perspired. If you've seen The Parting of the Red Sea, I always kind of wondered how the water gets back up. But anyways, made good theater, I suppose. And Sam, the Ark of the Covenant is probably not in a warehouse of the U.S. government. Probably not there either. Thank you for your time. I hope you got something out of that.